the Buddhist doctrine that Albert Einstein most admired. Welcome back, everyone, to Mind Podcast. Today, we will explore the doctrine of dependent origination, the most fundamental teaching of the Buddha. This doctrine helps people clearly see the truth of human existence, life, and the value of happiness. Dependent origination is also where Buddhism and scientists from various fields meet, and from these encounters, great benefits have been reaped. In the masterpiece Journey to the West, the demons are all blindly convinced that by eating the flesh of the pilgrim Xuanzang, they will achieve immortality. Thus, they devise all sorts of schemes to capture the monk to satisfy their desire for eternal youth and life. This detail clearly reflects the misconception that people often cling to, the stubborn belief that their body and soul have a permanent self, and they seek every way to protect and nurture it, causing suffering. However, no one, not even the Buddha, can defeat the law of impermanence in life. Understanding the principle of dependent origination will help you recognize many deeper truths. Dependent origination is briefly recorded in the scriptures as follows. If this exists, then that comes to be. If this arises, then that arises. If this does not exist, then that does not come to be. If this ceases, then that ceases. A simple example of the law of dependent origination in nature is as follows. Because there are clouds, it rains. Because it rains, the roads become slippery. Because the roads are slippery, people slip and fall. Because someone falls, they get hurt. Here the rain is due to the presence of clouds in the sky. The roads become slippery due to the rain, someone falls due to the slippery roads, and the person gets injured because of the fall. Countless events continue to unfold, all originating from the initial clouds. Conversely, if we ask what creates clouds, it's due to the condensation of water vapor. Why does condensation occur? Because of the increase in temperature, water evaporates into the sky. Thus, before that, there were numerous causes that formed the clouds, which we cannot fully enumerate in the sequence of events. We see that one event happens because a prior event occurred and influenced its occurrence. After it occurs, it in turn influences another event. Every natural phenomenon occurring in this world can be traced to a series of dependencies or mutual relationships. In other words, nothing ever happens independently. Nothing comes into being without an origin or an initial cause from a preceding event. Deeper still, if there was no prior event to trigger this event, then this event could not occur, and in turn, it wouldn't serve as a condition for the next event. This process continues endlessly. In summary, every object or phenomenon can be traced back to its origin, and other objects or phenomena can be traced as the result of its influence, due to its cause and condition. To better understand the nature of the doctrine of dependent origination, let's look at a real-life example provided by famous scientists. It begins with the concept of inseparability in quantum mechanics. This was a famous thought experiment introduced by Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in 1935 in an attempt to prove that the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics was incorrect and that this theory was incomplete. This experiment can be described simply as follows. Imagine a particle spontaneously decaying into two photons, A and B. The law of symmetry states that they will always move in opposite directions. If A goes west, we will discover that B goes east. Everything seems perfectly normal. However, we are forgetting the strange nature of the quantum world, and specifically light. These photons can behave as both waves and particles before being detected by a measuring device. Quantum theory tells us that A appears as a wave that is not localized, and there is a probability that A could be found in any direction. Only when A is observed do we know that it is moving west. However, if A didn't know beforehand which direction it was heading, how could B guess what A was doing in order to adjust its behavior and move in the opposite direction of A? According to Einstein, this is hard to accept unless A communicates with B synchronously about its direction. Therefore, Einstein believed that there was some hidden variable they had not yet discovered to explain this phenomenon. In the early 1980s, the scientific and technological field had matured enough for physicists like Alain Aspect and his team in Paris to conduct a series of experiments on pairs of interacting photons, specifically, photons that affect each other. In Aspect's experiments, photons A and B were kept 12 meters apart, and it was observed that B always immediately knew what A was doing and responded accordingly. The physicists ensured that no light signals could be exchanged between A and B, as atomic clocks were attached to the detectors to detect A and B, allowing them to measure the arrival time of each photon with extreme precision. They found that the timing of the two photons was identical, confirming that A and B did not communicate with each other beforehand despite being 10 kilometers apart. However, their behaviors still correlated perfectly. This phenomenon can be explained when we recognize that A and B have become part of an inseparable reality, even if each photon is at opposite ends of the universe. A does not need to send a signal to B because they share a common reality. Quantum mechanics thus eliminates any notion of locality and presents a holistic view of space. With these interacting photons, the concept of here and there becomes meaningless, as here is also there. This is what physicists call the inseparability of space. This idea is similar to the Buddhist concept of dependent origination, pratitya samutpad, in the phenomenal world. Buddhism views the world as an immense, flowing stream where events are interconnected and mutually influence one another. Meanwhile, the way we perceive this flow condenses into certain aspects of the indivisible universe, creating the illusion that there are independent entities completely separate from each other and from us. Thus, the biggest question arises: if every event has its cause, what is the first cause, and when does causality end? In ancient times, people observed strange things happening in nature and were always curious to find satisfying explanations. However, because they were unaware of the law of dependent origination and feared supernatural forces or deities, they naturally tried to explain things through beliefs in gods. Primitive people believed that when the wind arose, it was because the wind god was engaging in a union or preparing to wed a partner. If science had accepted such explanations and did not search for causes according to the law of dependent origination, we might never have known that wind or storms, essentially the movement of air, are simply due to differences in air pressure between regions. Superstitious or theistic explanations often put an end to questions or the pursuit of scientific inquiry in ancient times because people could no longer ask, who created the wind god? Or, what does the existence of the wind god depend on? The law of dependent origination is a scientific principle that has been and continues to be applied in all reasoning and research in science and technology worldwide. But if we focus on the idea of a first cause, it leads to a dead end. Asking that question halts any further scientific inquiry or discovery of natural laws, because if we keep asking, we will never find the first cause behind the origin of a living being. The Buddha said, "O bhikkhus, the beginning of samsara is inconceivable. The beginning of sentient beings cannot be seen. Sentient beings are shrouded by ignorance and attached to desires, drifting farther and farther, continuously coming and going in the cycle of birth and death." We can see that the Buddha did not raise the question of the first or the last cause. Everything exists because of causes, and it has always been this way and will continue to be so. The Buddha taught that all phenomena are non-self, all conditioned things are impermanent, and all things arise and cease due to causes and conditions. Dependent origination is not just a doctrine that reveals the principle of how all phenomena in the world operate, from the physical to the psychological. No phenomenon forms or disintegrates outside of this law. This doctrine was also the first to refute the Vedic philosophical system of Brahmanism, rejecting the idea of a creator deity, Brahma, and promoting the notion of self-agency. One creates one's own destiny and bears the consequences. This emphasizes the role of humans as the masters of their own lives, with no one else having the authority to determine their fate. In the Buddha's era, the teachings of the religious sects taught people to cling to the self and the possessions of the self. They created a supreme creator, a deity to worship and depend upon. Therefore, when the Buddha discovered and declared the doctrine of dependent origination, with the argument that everything, from the largest objects in the universe to the smallest particles of dust and grains of sand, exists due to the harmonious interaction of causes and conditions, both the body and the world are not truly existent. The Buddha affirmed the non-self nature of the Dharma realm and initiated a great revolution in thought at that time with the middle way view. No distinction between subject and object, and nothing is absolute. One is all is one. Dependent origination is a clear, powerful, and persuasive answer to the question that humanity has long awaited. Furthermore, the doctrine of dependent origination is a declaration affirming the freedom and equality of all people in society, completely rejecting the theory of caste and racial discrimination, which was fabricated by the exploiting class to serve their purpose of social domination and their own interests. For this reason, more than 2,500 years later, the scientist Einstein remarked, "If there is any religion that could cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism." Buddhism does not need to abandon its views to follow science because it encompasses science and surpasses it. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha taught that by completely eradicating craving and ignorance, the chain of formation ceases. When formations cease, consciousness ceases, and then aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, suffering, grief, and despair all cease. In this way, the entire mass of suffering is extinguished. O bhikkhus, when ignorance is eradicated, one sees the dharma of non-self and the impermanence of formations, no longer clinging to the self or phenomena. Thus, one attains perfect enlightenment and ends the cycle of birth and death. The value of liberation from suffering here lies in dependent origination, which returns humans to the role of being the master of their own destiny while also opening the path to liberation from the cycle of birth and death, leading humans and all sentient beings to the shore of peace and happiness. However, as lay Buddhists living a household life, meaning that we aspire to be reborn within the cycle of samsara, with a prosperous, fulfilled life and a beautiful body, the true value of liberation and enlightenment lies in the scientific, accurate understanding of the existence of body and mind within the unchanging law of formation, stability, decay, and dissolution. This prevents us from becoming attached to and suffering from the realities of life. In reality, the cells in our bodies are constantly changing, and every 7 years, these cells are completely renewed. This change causes us to grow, age, and of course, eventually die, due to the impermanence of the body. That is why the ancients said, "The body is like a fleeting shadow at twilight. Spring comes, blossoms bloom, autumn passes, and leaves fall." Why bother about the ups and downs of life? Prosperity and decline are like dewdrops falling on the top of the grass. The doctrine of dependent origination is truly beneficial for those suffering from terminal illnesses or those who are elderly and nearing the end of their life. This teaching helps people accept illness, endure pain, and face death calmly and naturally. It teaches us not to be selfish or greedy for personal gain, allowing us to tear apart the veil of ignorance and embrace the light of freedom and happiness. By understanding this teaching, we can avoid many consequences, such as class division, racial discrimination, and the suffering caused by wars, massacres, and the destruction of sentient beings, which sow immense suffering for both humans and all living creatures. Dependent origination helps us see the interconnectedness of all things in the universe. No phenomenon exists independently. Within one thing lies the seeds of another, and each element is both a cause and an effect simultaneously. This highlights the causal relationships between all things. In terms of society, when we understand dependent origination, each individual will realize that their existence in life is not solely due to the nurturing of their parents or the money earned through their own labor. Instead, we recognize that our physical and spiritual existence is the result of the combined interaction of countless factors. In this way, we see that our presence and existence in this life are miraculous results of many causes and conditions. Our warm, happy lives are made possible through the collective effort of many others. Our stable employment is the result of contributions from various individuals, and in the success of others, there is likely a small contribution from us, no matter how minor. With this correct and positive view, everyday Buddhists grow to love life more, and they strive harder in their work to contribute to the overall development of society. Dependent origination not only gives people a comprehensive view of life, but it also shows the path and guides individuals to make efforts to transform ignorance, develop wisdom, and see the ultimate truth in the nature of all phenomena. Those who understand this law through right view and right thinking can detach from clinging and attachment, thereby achieving a peaceful and happy life. This is the practical value of dependent origination and a profound lesson about life. The scriptures record that the Buddha's first realization about human suffering occurred in one night. He first saw that human suffering comes from birth, aging, sickness, and death, as well as sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. What is the cause of aging and death? It is birth. What causes birth? Existence, or the desire for rebirth. Why does existence arise? Because of attachment. Attachment arises from craving, which is rooted in feelings. Feelings come from contact, which is the interaction of the six senses. The six senses arise from name and form. Name and form arise from consciousness. Consciousness arises from mental formations, and mental formations arise from ignorance. After analyzing the 12 links that bind humans to the cycle of birth and death, the Buddha began to contemplate these factors. He reflected on dependent origination in a forward manner. Because of ignorance, mental formations arise. Mental formations give rise to consciousness. Ignorance is the cause, and mental formations are the effect. Due to ignorance, people give rise to actions, mental formations, and these actions lead to the arising of consciousness. When a person dies, their consciousness leaves the body and, depending on their karma, is reborn in a new existence, starting with name and form. From name and form arise the six sense bases: eyes, nose, tongue, body, and mind. These six sense bases interact with worldly phenomena, giving rise to contact. Due to contact, craving arises, which leads to attachment. When attachment occurs, the desire for continued existence, becoming, arises, and this becoming propels rebirth. With birth comes aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. These are the factors that make up suffering, known as the 5 aggregates of clinging. In the second contemplation, the Buddha analyzed dependent origination in reverse, meaning that if this does not exist, that will not exist. If this ceases, that will cease. Thus, if a person is completely free from craving and has wisdom to understand the nature of the world as impermanent, full of suffering and non-self, and has insight into karma, samsara, and dependent origination, then ignorance will be eradicated. The cessation of ignorance leads to the cessation of mental formations. The cessation of mental formations leads to the cessation of consciousness. The cessation of consciousness leads to the cessation of name and form. The cessation of name and form leads to the cessation of the six sense bases. The cessation of the six sense bases leads to the cessation of contact. The cessation of contact leads to the cessation of feelings. The cessation of feelings leads to the cessation of craving. The cessation of craving leads to the cessation of attachment. The cessation of attachment leads to the cessation of becoming. The cessation of becoming leads to the cessation of birth. The cessation of birth leads to the cessation of aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. Thus, the entire chain of suffering is completely eradicated. In the third contemplation, the Buddha once again reflected on dependent origination both forward and backward. After completing this contemplation, he systematically arranged the process in both directions. If this exists, that comes to be. If this arises, that arises. If this does not exist, that does not come to be. If this ceases, that ceases. That is, because of ignorance, mental formations arise. Because of mental formations, consciousness arises, and so on. This is the collection of the aggregates of suffering. By eliminating ignorance and craving without any residual defilements, mental formations cease, and consciousness ceases. Thus, the aggregates of suffering are eradicated completely. Having fully realized the doctrine of dependent origination, the Buddha attained supreme enlightenment and became the perfectly enlightened one, the teacher of gods and humans. He is revered as the historical Buddha, unparalleled in the world, known as Shakyamuni Buddha.